to the Pelican Pod, a podcast showcasing our talented authors and illustrators and the books they create. We'll be exploring the moments in history that inspire our books and the culture that makes them unique. This is Antoinette D. Alteris, PR and Marketing Director, and your host for the series. On this episode of the Pelican Pod, we welcome historians Keith Weldon Medley and Malik Bartholomew. We'll be talking about the legacy and influences of Black New Orleanians. Today on the Pelican Podcast, I'm excited to have with me Keith Weldon Medley, who is the author of 2 Pelican books focusing on Black history in New Orleans. The first book was recently mentioned in the New York Times. The case is certainly relevant. Plessy versus Ferguson was the fight against legal segregation that sort of placed itself into the limelight here in New Orleans. Tell us a little bit about that case and how you got started writing your first book.
Well, I started writing my first book because that's what I wanted to do as a child and everything. And I used to always do all kinds of things that would bring me to that path. And so even when I was in grammar school and everything, this is what I was doing. As it's turned out, it was like one of the best things I've done. What I'm doing is what I should be doing.
Well, you've done an excellent job at it. The research alone that went into this book is amazing. And I know you combed through records all across the city and in museums and different places.
Well, in Ghana, I was a person who did all kind of stuff, and that was part of my job too. And so I would go to wherever something was there, like I went to Ghana, went to where Louie Armstrong used to go, and all these other places, exotic places around the world. New Orleans has this place, but you're just shocked when you see the rest of the world,
Right.
And so doing that made me, get some money together and, go and do that passion that I've been having.
Now, you grew up in the Tremé area, didn't you?
Yes, you could say that. My father was a plasterer, and my mother was a school teacher when she was alive and everything. Her people, and this is separate but equals here right now, when we're doing this. All of her friends knew all about it, so they would go and get stuff about, what history meant to them. In the public schools, they have to kind of sneak around it because of the way the situations were there. Then I became a radical because I was at Southern University in New Orleans, and at that time that was separate but equal. And then like at Southern University in New Orleans, it was a really little.
It was a small school.
It had 2 things, and then you had UNO, which had really good places. Right,
it was the white school.
Yeah, it was the white school. So I was in there, and then, then things got worse. A lot of people were, getting angry because like the police would come and they'd knock the billy club on the lady, and all of that stuff. So we're doing this. Then we start getting, I guess you would call radicalized, but we really weren't doing anything bad. We were doing
civil protests.
Yeah, civil disobedience.
Yes.
Henry David Thoreau, who did that.
It's very interesting what we call a radical now.
Yeah.
As opposed to what was called a radical then. Because you could be labeled a radical in that era in New Orleans just for walking on the wrong side of the street.
Ask Bernie about that, So.
Right. So we have the situation with the book where the African rights were being ignored. There was this separate but equal that really wasn't equal at all.
But equal. But when I was at SUNO, it was still people dying doing this stuff. So
Right.
Yeah.
So what was it like when you were a student and going through high school, going through college, going through your early career as a Black man in New Orleans trying to do this research, really focusing on these injustices?
Well, after the Suno thing was dying down, I started just saying, okay, I'm going to go get books.
And sort of educating
Yeah,
yourself.
and educating not only myself, people that I knew around me. One thing that happened, and as far as Plessy versus Ferguson, I decided I was going to start doing that. So I was sitting on a place on Columbus Street.
Mm-hmm.
And a friend of mine, we used to sit on the stairs and everything. So somebody said, "Oh, I know Nicole Plessy." Okay, and so
that's a moment.
Yeah, that was the moment. And bang, I said, "Oh my God!" And then I started finding everything about Keith Plessy's stuff. Everybody that I knew in the country and then all over the world that
had little
that
bits and
kind
pieces.
Of bits and pieces
Yeah.
of it. Yeah.
Well, it's an amazing book because it's really the first of its kind that actually addresses this case. And, it's interesting when you look at the overall history of the equal rights or the civil rights movement.
Civil rights.
And you look at, most people know about Martin Luther King. They know about Birmingham. They know all these things. But very few people, until you wrote this book, very few people knew about the impact of this in New Orleans.
Yeah.
And then, we started going from here to Leah Chase and, the things that were going on there in the 50s as well.
Yeah. And I felt like, what I was doing was getting all of this out. So
exactly.
Everywhere I go, I have books. I walk through books. I'm going down the street saying, here's some books about this and all of that stuff. And people give me money for it.
That's always a good thing. We like that. Let's take money for books.
Yeah.
One of the things that's really amazing to me is that there haven't been any more books. I mean, of course, you did the definitive book. The research is there.
Well, I was shocked when I started doing it because
there was nothing else out there.
Yeah, because I'm going to look at it, but it wasn't there. And just like in Plessy versus Ferguson, like the lawyers care about that.
One of the other things that was really amazing to me when you went from this book to Black Life in Old New Orleans is that you sort of picked pieces out of that book that really resonated.
Thematic.
It was very thematic.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that book.
Well, one of the things that with me is Louie Armstrong. Mm-hmm. So everybody loved Louie Armstrong, okay? But I realized that has not been any statue of Louie Armstrong anywhere in New Orleans. And I said, wow, how can that be? That came into 1972. Mm-hmm. But all this time, there was no statue for anybody, any African American anywhere in New Orleans.
Which is crazy.
They had the Confederate 4 or 5 Confederate people who really weren't even
in the
there
city,
in the place or anything like that.
One of the things in Black Life in New Orleans is you start with Congo Square and you talk about the influence of the music and
Africa.
And Africa.
Nobody talked when I was growing up. Nobody really. It was a Tarzan movie,
right? Yeah, right. That's the only thing.
And
you knew.
Then there were no black people except it was a Tarzan movie.
Right.
And
Tarzan
I
was
realized
not black.
This isn't right, and so in the book I always have a lot of Africanism all throughout, mm-hmm. so that they can give them their due.
So the format for Black Life in New Orleans is chapter by chapter. You have a theme in each chapter, and you talk about a significant moment or a group that has historic importance. And, one of those is, of course, Congo Square.
Yeah.
You talk about the Freedom Riders, which is the source of Plessy versus Ferguson. You talk about the Mardi Gras Indians, mm-hmm. and some of the other, the Black Storyville, which is fascinating. Mm-hmm. We have this resurgence recently with mm-hmm. Diane Honoré and the baby dolls, which is, she's lovely. And another fascinating character in New Orleans. So I think that, the way that you've approached these books. Yeah, all of these clubs.
Which I'm in, so,
The recent movie that was featured with the New Orleans Film Festival last year was the Buck Jumpers.
Yeah, the Buck Jumpers, yeah.
Which is another era of, just another area of Black history that is just in the background.
And everything has been there for 100 years.
Yeah, it's nothing new. It's just that
and
people didn't know.
People try to get rid of all the history that has
Right.
been going on, and
Right.
and then with Katrina and everything, a lot of that history is washed away,
Right.
and that's one of the things I try to do is bring it
Capture
back
that.
up. Yeah.
Right. What are some of the things that you see as that are changing for the better?
Oh, for the better.
Yeah, we know too many of the things
Yeah.
changing not for the
Yeah.
better.
I don't know if it's changing for the better. It's just the same thing I've kind of been going along,
Hmm.
for a long, long, long time.
So, in the last few years, you've gotten quite a few awards. You've been recognized by Xavier University's Creole Center as a Creole historian.
Yeah.
You've been written up in multiple magazines. You're frequently quoted as the authority. And of course, we are having Malik Bartholomew join us later, and he has used your research extensively, as have most other tour guides in
Everybody
the
does.
city.
Yeah.
Yeah, they all think so highly of you. So we're looking forward to having Malik later, and we want to repeat the 2 books from Keith, our Black Life in Old New Orleans, which is a history of the African Americans' influence in New Orleans, and of course, Plessy versus Ferguson, which talks about the separate legal segregation and separate but equal rulings. Thank you again, Keith, for being with us.
Okay.
Is there anything else you wanted to add in before we leave?
Keith Plessy and Phoebe Ferguson.
Oh,
my
the
friends. Yeah, the
foundation.
foundation.
Yes. The foundation that's brought the 2 families back together.
Yeah, and I did the plaque on.
And
in
the plaque
press.
for
I've done 15 plaques.
for
Or
the
20
spaces.
because
Yes.
yeah,
Well,
and
cool.
that's what we want to do, that and keep doing these plaques and
Right.
everything. So the history would always be there.
And so that people can find it.
Yes.
I think that's one of the things is when you stand next to that plaque and you realize this is where it happened.
Yes.
Well, once again, thank you so much for being here.
Okay.
And we look forward to talking to you again soon. We're here today at the Pelican Podcast with my guest, Malik Bartholomew. He is the evening manager at Dillard University Library, and how I met him, he's the owner and tour guide at KnowNOLA And if you've never gotten to see one of his tours or experienced it, I encourage you to go on his website and book one now. I met him through Words and Music and executive director Megan Holt because he was doing the tour. And the tour was called Pathway to Plessy Ferguson. And the focus was, of course, on the civil rights journey of Homer Plessy and Judge Ferguson. Welcome, Malik.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm having a great time.
That's always
Already.
good. We make you stand in front of the microphone. We want you to have a good time. So one of the things that we talked about that you talked about on the tour was the significance of the city and the planning that went behind that civil rights protest. Take us through a little of that process.
So we did the tour based off of Homer Plessy. A lot of people don't know that New Orleans is one of the foundations of the modern civil rights movement. And one of the reasons is because of that is that we had a large amount of free people of color that was here in the antebellum South. So after the Civil War and after during Reconstruction, these African Americans were educated, skilled, had plenty of talent, and they were utilizing these talents to push the government forward with different governmental services and etc. And after Reconstruction ends and certain laws get turned back in to discriminate against African Americans, they use their education and legal know-how to challenge these laws. So this is how you get challenges against streetcar integration, as well as integrating the train system, or kind of like in their era, the bus system, which the train represents. So this is where you get this most famous Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson.
And there's actually a marker
Yeah.
now to sort of show the spot where he was removed from the train.
Yeah, so if you go in Bywater and on Royal and Press, which is now Homer Plessy Way, Royer and Homer Plessy Way, you will see an actual marker where Homer Plessy was ejected from the train for sitting in a white-only train car. Now, this is very ironic because Homer Plessy is a African American man that does not look African American. He's very much of the phenotype of Europeans, and these people who planned this case, every part is so ironic that every facet of this case was literally planned out by the committee, which was called the Citizens Committee, and this committee planned out every facet of this case, including using this man intraman named Homer Plessy.
I've seen the pictures of him, and I would never have known. To me, he looks a little bit Hispanic.
Yeah.
He's got a light coloring, but I never would have noticed he was
Well,
African American.
So this is the thing. There is no surviving pictures of Homer Plessy.
I guess it was a painting.
Well, no. So there's a Louisiana man named PPS Pinchback, who is the first acting black governor of any state in America. He was the governor of Louisiana for a couple of weeks.
A couple of weeks.
Yeah. Well, he I think the then governor either died or was removed, and he became governor. And he became governor until they had inauguration. However, a lot of people confuse his picture with Homer Plessy. So a lot of people think use PBS Pinchback, which I know the family of PBS Pinchback as well as the family of Homer Plessy was like, that's not Homer Plessy. So yeah.
One of the really cool things that happened on this day is you did this tour for us, and then we went to lunch at Dookie Chase.
Yes.
Which was amazing. And
always a treat to go to Dookie Chase.
And we'll get to that in a minute. But while we were there, we met the descendants of both Plessy and Ferguson families.
Yes.
And that was very interesting. Did you get to meet and talk with both of them?
Yes. So to make people a little bit understand the history, Homer Plessy is the person who was the main plaintiff in this case. However, the first ruling to get to the Supreme Court was ruled by a local judge named Judge Ferguson, who ruled against Homer Plessy and said that it was a state right to discriminate against Homer Plessy. And this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and there were descendants of the Plessy family and the Ferguson family. I know members of the Plessy family. Actually, one of the members of the Plessy family actually was a longtime professor at Dillon University. He's now in California, and I love Phoebe Ferguson, who works with the Plessy versus Ferguson Foundation. So Phoebe Ferguson, who's a descendant of Judge Ferguson, is like a wonderful lady, and she was there as well. So
she was fascinating to talk to, and the story that she told about how the two of them met through these different connections and brought the two families back together was really interesting. And of course, they have a foundation now that they're working to keep these civil rights activities and this awareness alive, particularly in New Orleans, but also across the United States.
Yeah, and they also they sponsor historical markers all around New Orleans, so they do wonderful work. The Plessy versus Ferguson Foundation, and it's great to see these two genuinely New Orleanian American families coming together like generations later to work together on history, which, I love history. I give tours, so I love history. So
never would have guessed you liked history. So one of the things that you did in your tour, which was really interesting, is, of course, we were on a bus.
Right.
So it was quite comfortable. We were in air conditioning, which was really nice. And we're touring around the city, and each time the driver took a turn, you pointed out these houses that some of them are still there that were so significant, half a decade ago.
Yes. So what a lot of people don't know about New Orleans is we literally breathe and live history. Now, a lot of people bemoan that New Orleans doesn't develop fast enough or whatnot, but literally all of these hundreds of years, like we have homes that are 100 or 200 years old, and they have literally their own histories where these people have actually lived in these homes, have made history in these homes, and died in these homes. So literally in New Orleans, we're surrounded by history, even as we walk down the street, or people don't know they may even live in a historical home and not have any clue that one of the former owners of the homes is a historical figure. So it's just fascinating to find out about these people and these actions that's happened in New Orleans.
I think so. I mean, some of the books that we publish are, we do one, The Walking Tours of Old New Orleans,
Yeah.
and I give it to all of my interns, and I think it's fascinating to see, to literally walk out on the street. And of course, in the French Quarter, we know there's a lot of history
Right.
because it's been there.
Right.
But when you get outside of that, you get to Tremé, you get to St. Augues, to the church, and you
Right.
realize this is the oldest operating Catholic church, Black Catholic church in the United States. There's a whole group of nuns that are out of there.
Right.
Then you look at places like St. Mary's and Ursuline and all of these places in the
Yeah.
city, not just for African Americans, but the Italians,
Right.
the Germans,
Right.
you know, all of these different nationalities here. We're so inundated with this metropolitan feeling. What are some of the really interesting stories that you are most excited about discovering in New Orleans?
Interesting stories. I mean, there's so many. There's so many characters. I mean,
Right. Characters
like,
is not something we don't have.
exactly. So New Orleans have a lot of just unique and special people that have done a lot of great things. I don't know if you can just pin down just one, because they all come together like that famous gumbo that we like to eat. So there's so many different things, and so many facets of people, from our musicians to our craftsmen, to just people who just cook. You know, just recently lost Leah Chase, and we realized the importance of cooking in the city and our chefs. And then also, even at her funeral, there was so many chefs of so many different races and nationalities that were there just to pay
from all around the world.
From all around the world. So, but particularly, you know, I'll tell people, it's great to have people all around the world, but when people from New Orleans recognize you as as one of the top things, that's a big compliment. You know, it takes a lot for people from New Orleans to say, "No, you're good at that."
Right.
And yeah, I mean, just so many different stories. So I would like to hear more stories about that, like the Chase family. I know they're working on like a little history room within their restaurant.
Right.
And
a new book.
Yeah.
So Miss Leah was working with Carol Allen, who's her biographer, before she passed away for the last 2 years, actually, on this book called A Long Way from the Strawberry Patch.
Wow.
And the life of Leah Chase. And it's her memoir told through these letters to God, starting as a young child, because she was a strong woman of faith.
Strong woman of faith.
And so she is literally writing to God as she's growing up about these challenges and these obstacles and her perseverance and these things that were happening in her life. And it ends, it includes, you know, her adulthood, and, you know, it sort of ends with her letter to young people saying, you know, I've been where you've been. And to read it is just so powerful.
Right.
She's, you know, we think about this woman that's here local. I've known her as long as I can remember, and been to the restaurant with my dad as a little kid, and then, you know, as a grown up. But, you know, I went to the Smithsonian.
And she's gonna remember you. She knew who you were. Yeah.
Well, the funny story is I like making jewelry, and she had a fondness for yellow beads.
Wow.
So I brought her some yellow beads one year, these big chunky stones I found, and she made me put them into a necklace, and I saw her in it a couple times, and that was just like, wow, Leah Chase is wearing my necklace. But, you know, I went to the Smithsonian, and there's the exhibit with Julia Child. She's right there as an icon. But, you know, we have other icons in the city, too, that people have forgotten. Like Lena Richards was the first African-American woman to have a television show.
Yes.
And she, too, was a chef.
Yes. And then, which we learned from, we mentioned the Ray Charles Material Culture Program at Dillon University. There was a famous African-American chef called Nellie Murray.
Exactly.
Who she was like, in her day, she was like Leah Chase, and she was like the prominent chef of New Orleans. And I believe that Alden McDonald of Liberty Bank, he's a descendant of Nellie Murray.
Mm-hmm.
So just these wonderful histories of people, and everyday people, whether they be cooks, whether they be craftspeople, who did great things with what they, whatever they could do. And even like the Italian grocery stores, I don't think a lot of people really realize the importance of the grocers in New Orleans. And literally, we had all of these local neighborhood grocery stores, even way up until when I was a kid, where you had these small grocery stores. They had everything,
right?
All type of food, meat, bread, and etc. And they were very important to the communities, and allowed them to make new foodways, like militons. Like we don't.
Exactly.
I think we're the only city that really love a good militon.
I had them as a kid, and I never had them until I came back. I came back before Katrina, and brought my family here, and I was like, there's these things. I couldn't remember what they were called, and they're like stuffed, and you eat them in the fall.
Yeah, we had a neighbor. She actually had her own militon vine. They would grow so plentiful, and like in the fall, she was like, "Oh, I can't
eat all of these."
So she would always give my mother militon. So it was like, so yeah, militons are awesome, and I love that they softer than bell peppers.
They are, and a lot of the Southern cooks do green tomato.
Yeah,
and I kind of think of the mirlitons as sort of the same vein. I've had them done in a fried, like sliced and fried, and they were good. They're not as good as stuffed, but
all right, yeah. Now, I would like to bring up, today is a special day for civil rights.
Is it?
Yes, because Alexander Pierre Thoreau, as we know it better as A.P. Thoreau, actually died on this day in 1972. And for a long time, A.P. Thoreau was the only Black attorney in New Orleans. So he was the official NAACP attorney for a long time. A lot of he was also mentor to Ernest Dutch Morial and a lot of our early Black judges and council people and etc. He sued to get his son into LSU.
I remember reading about that case.
So it was unfortunate though that if you was in his family, you probably wound up in a legal case.
Right.
So you use people that was right, exactly. So but Alexander Pierre Thoreau was very important in New Orleans, and he's definitely a New Orleanian that we should, even though we have a statue and a street named in his honor, we should always remember A.P. Thoreau. So shout out to the Thoreau family, because I know he has two daughters and a son that is still living. So
the other thing that happened in New Orleans is that there was a newspaper here. So we're looking back at the free people of color having a newspaper, one of the first African American newspapers.
Yeah, with Mr. Mark Rudenaz. Dr. Rudenaz is actually, he's the star. Charles Rudenaz started the New Orleans Tribune. But I don't know if his great grandson or his great grandson, but Mark Rudenaz, who's a great researcher, who just recently found out about this history of his family, of his ancestors having operated the first daily newspaper in New Orleans. And it was very important because it was considered one of the official organs of Congress.
Right.
So for Congress to say, this newspaper is so important that all of our members should read this, is very important. It says a lot about the former free people of color in New Orleans. So yeah,
I think it's really amazing when you look at this culture here in New Orleans as sort of a microcosm of the United States. The things that have happened here are precursors to things that happened elsewhere. And so now it would be nice if the rest of the country would follow where we are now. Maybe they should look at us again and see, how people get along. Certainly, we're always known for our murder numbers.
Yeah.
It's like that's what they keep repeating. And I say, well, think about the size of New Orleans and then look at the size of New York City and then compare it.
Yeah.
Because we're a pretty small, concentrated area.
We are. I mean, we're still in a swamp. There's a lot of people forget that New Orleans comes from a swamp, and there's a lot of people in a very small area. So you're absolutely right. We have to look at the numbers and stuff. However, last year was the lowest number of murders in the city, I think, since the 1970s or 1960s.
Yeah, I think they said 72.
Yeah, so
like that.
I think
that's
the city,
pretty good.
It is, and I think the city is trying to be better and do better. We just have to do each person in the community have to do their own part, but also they have to know exactly, especially for a lot of people who are coming into the city who may not really understand, they move from different areas, but it's really understand the historical importance of the history and the culture of the city. And that's why they should take a Know NOLA tour.
That's exactly right, which is a perfect segue because we're talking about Black History Month and, of course, the importance of the culture here from all of the different countries, not just Africa. We have a lot of Creole and French Creole, and
French,
Caribbean,
German, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Cuba, which unfortunately we have limited amount of travel right now to
But
Cuba.
A huge population here that
Dominican Republic.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of different cultural and ethnic influences in New Orleans, which you can hear. You see it in our food, you hear it in our music.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot to learn, a lot to take in. So sometimes you got to just really, and even for New Orleanians, it's great to take a tour and learn about this great history that you may not have gotten in school.
Yeah, I thought the tour was fascinating. And of course, I've read the books. I've read both of Keith's books, The Black Life in Old New Orleans and We as Freemen, about the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And of course, The Walking Tours of Old New
Yeah.
Orleans.
So We as Freemen was pivotal in my understanding. Of course, I've studied history my entire life, so you always hear the name Homer Plessy. And very little is known about Homer Plessy. And Keith Melody, literally in his book, We as Freemen, he gives you just such a great snapshot of the era and the times and of his neighborhood and his life all the way up throughout the case. So it's like you're literally walking the path with Homer Plessy, and you really, if you understand New Orleans, it's truly like just moment in time where you just understand certain things. And I actually, while curating the tour, I learned a lot about Homer Plessy, which I had no idea existed.
Yeah, it was fascinating, both the tour and, of course, listening to Keith. But if you had one thing you wanted to tell people about New Orleans to remember from Black History Month, what would it be?
Honestly, I think would be the history of Congo Square. Because Congo Square is so pivotal of an example and of a place in a space. It's a place of culture, it's a place of music, it's a place of persistence and of just an enduring memory of liberty and freedom. So I think for me, like most of my tours in some way is centered around Congo Square in some ways. Congo Square is such an important part of not just Black history, but New Orleans history, because so much of what we know about New Orleans is coming or going to come out of Congo Square, which is located in Louis Armstrong Park, for those people who may not know. So Congo Square is very important. So just the history of Congo Square, which I know Freddie Evans is.
Yeah, she did the book with us.
Yeah, so she's an awesome historian, and she wrote the history of Congo Square. It's just a great story that I'm always going back to. So
yeah, and that's one of the things that we talk about is this documentation is so important. So it's nice that we have these records of that particular space, because as you pointed out, it gave us clues to many other things, connecting to the plantations, connecting to Uptown and the downtown areas, the Treme.
Right.
But it's so significant to look at our past to see where we can go in the future.
Right.
So thank you so much for being here with us today.
I'm glad you invited me. This is awesome.
And we hope that we get to see you more and more frequently.
Hey, you can call me and invite me if I have time. I definitely would love to stop by. And I guess I have to get started on writing a book.
You do. You have a lot of information we got to capture. All right. Thank you, Malik.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Pelican Pod. We release new episodes every 2 weeks on YouTube and SoundCloud. If you'd like to read these books and more, visit your local indie bookstore or find them online.
The Pelican Pod is brought to you by Pelican Publishing, an imprint of Arcadia Publishing.